Interdimensional War by Dagaan Galacticos. Chapter 4. Journal entry, November 29th, 2004. Before going to sleep, I reread the part of Monroe's book where he describes going out of his body by turning around 180 degrees inside his physical body and going out the back of his head. This leads him to a place where there is a world much like ours and people who are very similar to humans. This passage has stayed with me, and I've been wondering if I could go there. So when I got the buzzing feeling going, I turned around carefully inside my body and went forward cautiously. With a sudden rush, I spurted out the top of the back of my neck and was suddenly shooting through dark space. After a bit, I was gliding through tall waves of a blue mist. It was like an ocean of dense, dark blue vapor, and the waves were incredibly tall and moving in very slow motion. There was a very soft and continuous thundering and hissing like the sound of the ocean in the distance. A dark, rich perfume filled the air like a garden of lavender at night. I felt an emotional tenderness so powerful that I'd forget I was on a mission to duplicate what Monroe had done, to reach this place. I had to make the decision to investigate the blue waves at another time, and with a great effort pushed on. I came to an opening in the darkness like Monroe describes. It was an oval, rounded opening like a cave. Its rim was bordered with the same cobalt blue light as the waves, which were still moving in a ghostly kind of majesty behind me and stretching away for what looked like forever. In an alphabet I had never seen, but easily understood, curled letters that resembled the snaky curves of the waves spelled the word Ovvala around the rim of the entry in some ancient language that I seemed to know. As I was reading these letters, a magnetic force overwhelmed me and sucked me through, and I was flying slowly over a huge city. At first I just saw hundreds of winking lights as though through barbecue fumes. Then the shapes of tall office buildings came into focus below me. Some of the buildings were very modern, and some were old-fashioned buildings made out of cut stone, as I've seen in war pictures of Berlin and Paris. Images of the city were vague at first, but as my sight became more focused, I saw people walking on the sidewalks and vehicles on the streets. UFOs were floating slowly and silently over the airspace of the city. When I experienced this at the time, it didn't seem so extraordinary because when I'm out, everything is like a dream. But now I'm wondering, what was that? I continued to glide over the city, pulled by some force or purpose I didn't fully understand. I passed beyond the city and then drifted slowly over a dark rural countryside. I clearly saw the constellations of Orion and the Big Dipper. I automatically found the North Star and acknowledged that the stars must be the same as ours. I was being pulled along by a sense of direction that I wasn't choosing, but which I felt compelled to follow. I drifted down over the tops of tall evergreen-like trees towards some small straw-thatched cottages separated by hedges and trees. The countryside looked like England or Germany as they appear in the paintings and history books in the 1700s and 1800s, before the Industrial Revolution, except that everything seemed curved and elongated in an odd way. The shapes of the houses, the gardens, the farm fields, all these had elongated curves to them. I guess I was looking with the eyes of a builder, and these lines were illogical to me because there were so few right angles. Elaborate little fenced gardens were next to each house. Each garden was carefully organized into different sections. There were few leaves left on the trees and plants, so that the season seemed to be about the same as New Mexico. The rich, tangy green smell of evergreens filled the air in a comforting and familiar way. I noticed little economy-sized UFO discs of different colors, like large glistening M&Ms parked in most of the driveways of the cottages. Between the houses were the oval farm fields. The broken stalks of corn registered in my mind as the source of a dry, warm, dusty smell mixed with the evergreen smell. With the shapes of the blue waves fresh in my mind, I saw a resemblance to them in the shapes of the farms and houses. And though it was night, I could see the essence of the colors, particularly the evergreen trees, which were a dusty, powdery, soft and glowing shade of dark green. This green glow of the trees gave me the strange sensual desire of wanting to eat them or kiss them. I wanted to lick the needles. It was as though they were food. There was a gentle, thrilling energy coming out of the trees. I was pulled down toward one of the gardens and found myself standing on the ground. To my right, I saw a boulder sticking out of the side of a hill that looked very familiar, and I was drawn to it. Then I saw the clump of quartz crystals near its upper rim and realized it was just like the boulder in Lena's garden. The hump of quartz crystals sparkled in the brilliant moonlight. The now nearly full moon was floating above the top of the boulder, almost exactly as I'd seen in Lena's garden the night before I fell off the ladder. This garden was more lush than Lena's, and the plant stalks unfamiliar. The fence around the garden was in a different shape than Spencer and Lena's garden, and made out of wood, where Lena's is barbed wire, but the slope in the land was just like Spencer and Lena's land. As I looked longer and became accustomed to the different sense of color and the elongated lines of the houses, and breathed in the smells of the night, I realized there was a different radiation to life here. Matter was inherently, atomically different than Earth. It was like the inexplainable difference a male or female feels toward the other sex. And yet this difference felt strangely familiar. An intense wave of goosebumps traveled up my arms and neck at the alien familiarity I experienced. My heart began beating violently as though something tremendous was happening. My body felt completely at home there, but in my mind I was going through the mother of all déjà vus. The leaves left on the trees had the same elongated curves as the blue waves. These were echoed by the shapes of the gardens and farm fields, and on the cornices of the cottages, and in the silhouettes of UFOs. There was no resistance to flow. There were so few right angles, or the intersections of X's. This unresisted flow created a sense of moving energy. When next to a tree or a plant, some of its color came off onto my breath. I was breathing colors. It was eerie, but I also felt happily drunk. There were no telephone poles or electric wires anywhere, and the few street lights cast lights of different colors. An orange one followed by a pink one, then a bright green one, etc. In the distance I could see the city lights twinkling. Next to the garden there was a cottage with its lights on, and I felt drawn to go into it, but began to feel overwhelmed by the odd uniqueness of it all. My eyelids began to droop with sleep, and I was pulled back into my body. I woke up in bed in the stillness and silence of my room. I heard the gurgling of the fish tank and saw its green glow. I felt a warm happiness inside and reviewed pictures of what I had just seen for a long time before I turned on the light and wrote it down. Journal entry, December 2, 2004. As I went out the back of my head, I felt a brief thrilling vibration. It was a silly feeling, like when I was a little kid in the back of a car going fast over a hill and felt like I was going to pee in my pants. The place where I went out of my head was a very specific place. It was at the base of the skull at the top of the neck. I then passed through the huge blue waves of the gaseous liquid and again felt a deep, heart-centered tenderness and wanted to stay there, but felt a sense of mission to be on time somewhere. I came to the oval opening and passed through. Instinctively, I seemed to travel stretched out with my arms forward, just like Superman. I flew like this through the night sky over the same countryside of oval fields and groves of trees, and came to the thatched cottages and farm fields below me. The rich smell of evergreens surrounded me with a feeling for the power of the life in the land. I landed in the garden with a boulder with a crystal hump. In the distance, I saw the lights of the city as before. I felt pulled in that direction. I became intensely curious about the look of the buildings and began to float towards them. Then I was flying low over the city. There were tall buildings of steel and glass. The newer buildings were mostly made of glass in fluid designs. Some were water green, others blue, dark gold, dark red. UFO craft were flying silently and slowly in single-file air lanes going in different directions and at different elevations over the city. Between the buildings there were gardens with miniature greenhouses and orchards planted in neat rows. Between the buildings and passing through the gardens were grassy paths with stepping stones and people walking along them. Of its own accord, my body assumed a standing position and I joined the people walking. When I was on the ground, I noticed window boxes attached to the buildings with flowers and herbs growing in them. These were lit softly from above. As a man walked by one of these boxes, he stopped, put his briefcase down, and pulled some weeds out from between some flowers, then picked up his briefcase and walked on as though this was a perfectly normal thing to do. I noticed that he had oddly elongated, peaked ears, but other than his having a long and narrow face, he looked human. This made me curious about the appearance of the people, and I watched as another man walked by. He also had the long, narrow face and peaked ears. His features were sharp, a defined jaw, prominent brows, a strong down-sloping nose. The rest of his body was unremarkable because it looked like any human's. His hair was remarkable in that it glowed with health. His whole being glowed with health. I mean, he really glowed. Some kind of actual light seemed to illuminate his features from within. As I continued to walk along, the rich smells of the garden boxes on the sides of the buildings and along the walkways rose up to meet me. A woman and a man came around a corner laughing and talking in a rapid-fire way, like Puerto Rican but with a lot of vowels. It was a sing-song way of talking as the voices went up and down in melodies, and there were actual long notes. They had the sharply defined faces and chins, large eyes, peaked ears, and the incredible glowing hair. I followed them, and we came to a large, brightly lit portal that led into an indoor shopping area, and I entered behind them. I should say, no one paid any attention to me. I was as invisible as the air, and while the sights and smells and physical presence of the people around me were real, it was also like watching a movie at a distance. We had entered an indoor sort of farmer's market. There were booths and hundreds of people shopping and talking loudly. Everyone was dressed colorfully and with conviction. These felt like city people, proud, defined, energetic, busy. I became fascinated with the clothing people wore. It was unique, colorful, and stylish. Many had jackets with theatrically exaggerated lapels or flared sleeves and cuffs, elegant dress gowns with long sleeves and gloves, different shaped elf-like hats, knee-high boots. I saw two serious young men who looked medieval. Their coats had cuff sleeves and they wore pantaloons. Each also wore a short sword and a scabbard at their side. I noticed then that a number of men wore swords, whether dressed stylishly or not. Being surrounded by these people in a large group like that, I felt the intense presence of a collective kind of mental intensity. Their minds felt intensely, even painfully aware. Their physical presence was unique as well. They were like dense holograms of flesh, but not flesh like human flesh. Their biological flesh seemed to be almost semi-transparent. The mental intensity and the peculiar energetic of their bodies seemed to go together somehow. I became aware of an upward pull that we were all feeling, but also consciously resisting. The sky, the universe, was pulling everyone's minds upward like a magnet. Anti-gravity? It was some kind of social code to pretend this wasn't happening. Why? The vegetables in the food stalls were of odd sizes and strange colors that I had never imagined existed. Red oblong beet-like things and things that looked like huge semi-transparent grapes, slabs of flat, juicy leaves that looked like a kind of fruit. There were all kinds of oddly shaped and textured leaves of many colors, red, violet, green, yellow, that were displayed as food for sale. There were an unusual variety of shades of green. The color green in particular had an iridescent shine to it. There was also normal and abnormal-looking poultry and fish on ice for sale. The food, like the people, glowed with an inner light. The presence of the vegetables and the food was very exciting to the people milling around the stalls. People were continuously pointing and exclaiming about the food. The continuous sense of an upward pull began to fizz and wiggle like Alka-Seltzer in my brain, and I looked up. As I did so, I noticed that most people in the market were also looking up. A kind of astral fish or serpent with colored fins swooped down through the ceiling and then went back up, leaving a trail of shimmering colors behind it. Everybody oohed and ahed and then nonchalantly went back to picking through the vegetables. They had all looked up at once, sensing the thing together. It hadn't made any sounds that I could hear, and yet we all looked up at the same time. What was that? I heard a burst of girlish laughter and singing and turned to see 3 college-age girls walking with their arms tightly linked together. They each wore pants but were bare-breasted with their blouses and sweaters tied around their waists. They had gleeful, defiant expressions on their faces and were singing in the vowel-filled language. I clairvoyantly understood the words of their song through the mental vibrations of everyone around me. We are Ovvalan women from Sala. Our breasts give life to all. It is not our fault that you find them irresistible. It's the milk of God within them that you love. Be happy you aren't dead yet, and leave us to our freedom. They sang. A hush had come over the crowd as the girls sang, and then wild and happy laughter burst out when they finished. A number of older women yelled out, "Karulia!" and momentarily lifted their blouses at the girls, who laughed wildly and yelled, "Karulia!" back in a chorus as they giggled and laughed and ran through the marketplace. The 2 serious young men took out their swords and slapped them noisily against their metal scabbards, smiling proudly at the running girls who smiled coyly back. I mingled with the crowds, leaving the market area, and went out into the street where there were people sitting at tables and chairs, eating and talking as waiters brought food. A block away, silent, squat-wide buses stopped and people got on and off. As one of the buses, which were completely silent, turned a corner, I could see the lighted insides. There were seats with a central aisle. Each seat was capable of seating 5 or 6 people. There were window boxes along the buildings bordering the outdoor restaurant and dwarf fruit trees growing out of the ornamentally bordered areas in the sidewalk. The inner glow of vitality in the trees and the people moved like a light green mist between everyone, carrying the smells of earth and plants. Was it only me who could see the colors drifting through the air because I was out of body? Far overhead, the UFOs streamed silently in traffic lanes. I sat down in an empty chair at a table with 2 women and a man using laptops. They were oblivious of me. The laptops looked just like ours, except that the characters on the keys were in a Cyrillic kind of script. Sitting close to these people, I felt the glow of health that radiated out of them. It activated my own sense of healthy well-being. When I've been in the astral around humans, the vibrations are steady and regular, but Ovvalans are different. Their vibrations are fast and erratic. I felt waves of subtle mental intensity coming off these people. Their skin fascinated me. It was made out of a dense kind of light or a cool fire. I reached out and ran my fingers along the arm of the woman next to me. Her skin was smooth and cool, but made my fingers feel hot. She brushed her arm unconsciously. She had felt my touch. As they talked in their sing-song voices, I could feel their intelligence in my own brain as sharp lines of awareness that almost hurt. Their minds were intensely focused and electric. Sitting so close to them, I began picking up on their emotions. Between the sharp waves of thought, there were sudden deep valleys of longing or sadness, sudden peaks of ecstatic delight, or a momentarily deeply depressing, sinking feeling that was immediately replaced by the sharp thought lines. Their emotions changed very quickly. They were explosively intense and yet very controlled. There were 4 women seated at a table a couple of tables away from me who had been laughing and hooting loudly. They were waving their arms around dramatically as they talked or warbled. They had been having a lot of fun. Their laughter calmed me from the intense emotions of the conversation near me. The 3 arm-linked girls stalked back into the marketplace with their tops now in place and proud, defiant, and smug smiles on their faces. One of the women at the table I was watching hollered out, "Karulia!" at the girls, who screamed the word back with defiance. The other women at the table also hooted. One of these women transfixed my attention. She was tall and had glowing bronze skin and long auburn hair fixed in a loose braid down her back that seemed to writhe with its own life force. Her mannerisms were very dignified, formal, and yet feminine and wise, and when she laughed aloud at what the other women were saying, her laugh was low and personal. When she smiled, her electric green eyes gleamed with such deep pleasure and awareness that I felt lit up inside by it. Even among the exotic beauty of these strange women, she stood out for me. I was very attracted to her, and as I was feeling this attraction, she turned suddenly and looked right at me, so that I wondered if she could see me. A little sphere of glowing blue light bloomed between us, a blue like the ocean of waves, and then one of the women spoke to her, and she turned away. The sphere of blue light slowly faded in the air as I watched. Suddenly, a hush came over the sing-song hum of chatter of people at the tables, and one word was being repeated from table to table like a warning. "Skander! Skander!" The voices became subdued, and all attention was turned toward a group of 5 or 6 men walking slowly towards the street cafe along the grassy path. They were dressed in a kind of uniform, so that I assumed they were police. They had long, shiny black boots and wore light gray, waist-length capes with black borders and cuffs. These were open at the chest to reveal shiny metallic objects strapped across their chests. Their vibration was also very different than those of the people at the tables. There was a closed density and menace about them. They slowed their pace as they came up to the tables, their boots clicking sharply on the flagstones. They looked around at the people with contempt and made comments among themselves and laughed mockingly. One of the men, whose cape had bold designs on the lapels different from the other men, perhaps an insignia of rank, walked rapidly right through the seated crowd. As he passed the woman with the bronze skin I had been watching, he quickly leaned down, slid his hand along her front, and kissed her on the cheek. She screamed and kicked him in the leg, and he instantly slapped her in the face. A man at another table leaped to his feet, drew a sword, and slammed his palm into the officer's chest, who then used a judo-like move that threw the man to the ground. As the officer turned my way, I noticed his high, narrow white forehead and the contrasting, sharp black widow's peak of his hair. The fallen man lurched to his feet to again confront the soldier. Immediately, the 5 other men in capes rushed up. One of them pulled out the silver object on his chest and shot the man who had fallen to the ground with an electric bolt that cut through the air like lightning. A woman screamed. The man collapsed, hunched over, around his wound with his clothes smoldering. Then one of the group in the gray capes tossed the cape aside to reveal herself as a pale woman dressed in a belted, tight, nylon-like bodysuit that revealed everything. She was clearly of another species. She had very large, unblinking black eyes and pronounced, exaggerated facial features, breasts, and hips. Her skin-tight suit was completely out of place in this public garden. She was wearing a black leather collar, which I now saw was attached to a leash held by one of the men. She was a very strange, wild-looking woman, but very beautiful. Waves of black light pulsed out of her eyes. Looking at her eyes, I had the sense that she didn't have a mind at all, but had only emotions. On seeing who or what she was, the people at the tables began hissing the word "Seal, seal," and a vibration of intense disgust filled the air. They feared and hated the men in gray, but they were revolted by the strange woman. The black-eyed woman, sensing the hostility of the crowd, laughed melodically and made an obscene gesture and replaced her cape. The soldiers with her burst into loud laughter and then turned and walked her away. The man who had been shot was lifted up and seated in a chair. Someone patted his shirt front down with a wet napkin. He was groggy and stunned, but didn't seem seriously hurt. The woman with the braid, who had had such a magnetic effect on me, had gone over to the group around the fallen man. She spoke to him, probably thanking him for his heroism. Her friends picked up their shopping bags and were leaving along with everyone else at the restaurant. The woman with the braid joined the group walking with the shot man as he was being walked away by his friends. What a shock! What had been a jolly and exotic experience became depressing and ugly. I continued to sit at one of the tables watching the woman with the braid as she boarded a bus and disappeared into the night. When I looked back at the empty restaurant, I noticed a man sitting alone. His aura looked different than the Ovvalans. A dark border surrounded him in heavy, sagging contrast to their bright energy. His face was waxy and pale. He was looking straight at me. He was in his 50s or so, had heavy pouches under his eyes which seemed watery and bloodshot. He looked very tired. As I continued to look at him, I clearly heard his voice in my head. "Hello," he said, without moving his lips. He continued to look at me calmly. I thought, he can see me. "Of course I can see you. I've been watching you since you sat down. You're not a remote, are you? You look different. Your vibe is different." A remote? I formed the question in my mind more than in response to him. "How did you get here anyway?" he asked me, clearly speaking telepathically. I felt his energy was penetrating mine, and it felt uncomfortable, too familiar and close. But I was compelled to respond to him. "I read a book by Robert Monroe, and—" "Oh, Monroe. And what? You just went down the rabbit hole and popped up here?" he asked. His voice was whiny and somehow sticky. I didn't like him. He was very pushy, intrusive, and aggressive. He felt dirty. "How did you get to here?" I asked, guarded now. "I'm doing a remote. My ass is lying on a slab in Langley, slathered with belladonna." He stared at me, puzzled. "You don't know what the hell I'm talking about, do you?" I could only stare at him, wondering who or what he was. "I'm with the Bats, Belladonna Attention Transference Syndrome Battalion. I'm a remote viewer. We're usually under guidance. We check out hostage situations or gather info on a target too risky to approach in the physical. The control then asked questions about locale, number of personnel, weapon systems, security levels, stuff like that. But on my days off, I sometimes do this alone, see? I invented a system. I rub on the belladonna, lie down on my bed at home, and start a tape recording I made to guide myself to a location and then back home. I like to come to Ovvala and see what's happening. But the real hot stuff is the seals. Did you see that one with the Scandir soldiers? He sensed that I didn't understand him. You're as green as grass, aren't you, asswipe? You don't know where the hell you are or what's going on, do you? You're probably astral projecting in a dream. You won't even remember talking to me. He walked over and sat next to me. The seal are Scandir slaves from the Klepoth. They're like demons, succubi, in the big black book. Here in Ovvala, they can actually materialize physically. They're wild. Where is Ovvala? I asked him. My skin crawled at the creepy feel of his energy. It's a waste of energy talking to you. You won't remember a thing. He stared at me. Ovvala is the parallel dimension to Earth, he said impatiently, looking around for something of more interest than me. It's more etheric. I looked at him blankly. The Knights Templars? You're a dumbo for sure. But it sure is weird meeting a human here. I've never had a conversation with a human here. I'm always here alone, floating around like Casper the Friendly Ghost. Unless the Adrics spot me, then I've got to get back pronto. What's the Adric? I asked. The Scandir Psychic Police. They could see us just like we could see each other. But they'll try and trap you with an electrical net, so watch your ass, bud. Then there's the Siddhe. They're these revolutionaries who are fighting the Scandir. Some of them can see us too. They'll follow you back to your body and spy on you. He leaned toward me, his eyes like a sick bloodhound's. Is Ovvala a real place, or is it a dream? I asked him. Is it real, or is it a dream? He mocked me, making his voice nasal and preppy. Are we, talking, or are we dreaming we're talking? Gotcha. He looked bored and exasperated again. It's just a different frequency of energy. It's the matter-antimatter thing. Earth is matter, this is antimatter. He spoke like he was bored to death. Sometimes you'll see entities from the next level above this one pass through the sky. That's like the etheric plane to this place, as this is the etheric to the earth. I saw a fish or something fly through the air over at the market. I felt exposed and odd, like I couldn't stop telling the truth, as though I were a little kid with a demanding adult. Yeah, like that. That's another world. Like the Underworld where the seal come from is another world. We can't go to those places. Our energy structure won't let us. Imagine going where the seal women live. Wowzers. And then you'd have to deal with the males, the Volwan. They fight dirty. Don't mess with them. So, what did you say your name was? He asked me. Joe, I said. And where did you say you live? I knew I hadn't said either my name or where I lived, and felt him trying to get behind me now. Istanbul, I said sarcastically. Oh, Istanbul, eh? I've never been there. Incredibly, he believed me. Uh-oh, he groaned, and bent over and gagged. His aura got dark brown. I think I'm going to be sick. Then he vanished. I sat at the table for a little while, wondering what that had all been about. The guy left me with a very creepy feeling. Some Ovvalans were walking along the path through the garden, between the buildings. Their energy sparkled with a light green shimmer which seemed to bounce back to them from the plants in the boxes. I got up and walked closer to them. A beautiful bunch of flowers in a planter pulled my attention, and I drifted over there. They were not earthly flowers. Their beauty erased the presence of the bat's character from my energy field. The flowers had broad, wrinkled petals with violet veins in a crimson background. The droopy green leaves pulsed with radio waves of biological vitality. My attention became hazy, and I began drifting upwards along the dark gold windows of an office, and woke up.